Oh, there we go.
Oh my gosh, this is
What's up, guys? Welcome back to the third episode of the Think Outside podcast presented by Baits.com. My name is Joey Bissing, and I'm the social media manager for GSM Fishing. I'm joined by...
Hey, guys. I'm Jack Dice. For those who don't know, I work at GSM in product development. I'm the product development manager over all the baits and lures and all the things that we've got tackle-wise here at GSM across all the brands, Yamamoto, Bill Lewis, Buckeye. I'm losing count at this point, but we're hanging out tonight. We're here at Lake Lanier, just working an event, and we're going to sit down and talk some bass fishing with a special guest.
Yeah, we got a super special guest today, guys. We're super excited. We got Drew Gill on with us tonight. He's joining the room right now. Drew, how are you doing?
doing great, man. How are you?
Awesome. So I know you just wrapped up the Harris Chain event with I believe a 10th place finish with the BPT tour. And would you just kind of, we're really going to focus on talking about forward-facing sonar throughout this whole podcast and kind of your strategy behind it all, how you attack the BPT tour and your other events, with one period forward-facing sonar and just kind of all that stuff. Could you kind of give us a quick recap on your BPT tour event?
So we are 2 events into the season with the Bass Pro Tour. Finished up 7th at Conroe, then 11th at the Harris Chain, 10th in the knockout round, and ended up getting bumped because of it, because we have the auto qualifier now. So basically, if you win the qualifying round, you go on to that championship round automatically. Everybody else goes to the knockout round. 9 go from the knockout round. So when you look at those results from the knockout round, for everybody at home, it may be a little confusing because it'll say 9th, then cut line, then 10th, and you might think that you're, whoever's, it's essentially one spot offset. So basically, first in the knockout round is really second in the tournament, and so on and so forth, because of that auto qualified bid that Jacob Wheeler got at Harris Chain. So Harris Chain was a super interesting tournament. We've seen 2 very different ends of the spectrum to start the season with the new format, which was Conroe. You could have a very good tournament, have a top 10 without catching a single bass outside of using scope. During your scope period, you could obliterate them and go eat Twinkies at the Boat Dock. Harris Chain was the exact opposite. You could have a very good tournament or win the event without ever having to turn scope on. So they were 2 polar opposites, and to go out and kind of approach them a little bit different, Conroe was like pedal to the metal, foot to the floor. You better be more efficient, more accurate, more effective than everyone else at what you're doing. And then at Harris Chain, it was you could have it to yourself if you found something special, but odds are you weren't going to even be hardly using it unless you found something very unique. And that's what I ended up finding. That's what I hunted for, because I knew I'd kind of have a monopoly on the scope period if I was to find something offshore at the Harris Chain this week, which I did. It was a super fun tournament. I caught them primarily on a jerkbait and a Nico and a drop shot. When I say Nico / wacky, but I threw Nico offshore. I threw the wacky up shallow, and it was a really, really fun tournament. I had a 2-prong approach. Offshore, I was fishing some transition areas. When everybody says transition, it can mean different things. In this sense, areas where the contours kind of broke off out in front of some spawning areas, some flatter basins. And it was my deal off the bank for sure. There were zones where you'd get, singles to groups of 2 and 3 out there sitting around, just waiting to come up. They were all really white, really healthy, good looking fish, and caught them on a jerkbait and a drop shot and an eco out there, depending on the conditions. So when it was really calm and sunny, I threw a jerkbait. Whenever we had a little bit more wind, a little bit more adverse conditions, we had a lot of pollen in the water. And if there was a lot of pollen stirred up, it'd get down to 5-6 feet under the surface, they wouldn't come up to eat the jerkbait. So I picked up the Nico after that. And then we got to a certain situation where it got so windy. I think it started disturbing the silt, disturbing the bottom a little bit. And they stopped eating that Nico because they wouldn't eat up on a jerkbait. And after the bottom had been blown out from switching from south one day to north really hard the next, they stopped eating things on the bottom. because a lot of times in Florida and on your lakes that have more of that vegetative growth, you got a lot of nutrient matter on the bottom that gets stirred up with the wind. And so it kind of gets hard to get them to bottom sometimes. So the final day, I switched to a drop shot. They wanted to feed down, but they didn't want to eat something off the bottom, so that drop shot was the right approach. Made that adjustment a little bit late. It was enough to keep me in it in the knockout round, but wasn't enough to blow it out. But it was a cool tournament. I did that offshore, and then when I wasn't using scope, I went up on the bank and went and fished clean spots in the eelgrass / bedfish with a wacky worm and a very light drop shot, and caught all my fish during the non-scope periods doing that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So how do you kind of attack a lake like the Harris Chain? You know, you go traditionally, you think of the Harris Chain, Florida, you're not really thinking about scoping. You're really like, okay, where do I need to go flip? Where do I need to go throw a wacky rig when they're spawning? Kind of how do you attack that knowing, you know, your main thing, everyone kind of knows this is scoping. How do you kind of go there and be like, okay, I'm going to need to figure out how to scope here?
Yeah. So when you come into a Bass Pro Tour event, your primary focus, the first thing that's in your mind is bite frequency. How fast can I get bit? And it's not necessarily just how fast can I get bit. You know, obviously average quality plays into it because there's certain situations like we saw at the Harris Chain where when we went to the bank, when we weren't using scope, the average quality was 10, 12 ounces heavier in a popka than it was where I was fishing, which meant that, you know, over the course of them catching 4 bass, you know, I had to catch 5 of them to pick up the weight they'd catch in 4. And so for every 12 bass they caught, I had to catch 15. And those numbers just kept expanding across the tournament as we went on because of that average quality difference. But first thought you're thinking about is bite frequency. How fast can I get bit? How consistently can I get bit? Which it makes it easy to look for that off-the-wall stuff, because in a 5-fish tournament, to have something off the wall that works, really what you have to have is you have to have something where the average bite quality is really high, or the average bite ratio is really high, meaning you catch everything you throw at. Your bite percentage goes through the roof. Those are the 2 things you're looking for in a 5-fish tournament to make something off the wall work. Every fish counts. You're going to have a high bite frequency in terms of your bite ratio, bite percentage, and you're going to have to be around a lot of fish. You're going to have both those things, which makes it very easy to diagnose how you need to attack it, because you know, as Vanilla Ice once said, anything less than the best is a felony. And in the Bass Pro Tour, anything less than the best hole in the entire lake is not going to compete to try and win. So I spent the entire week looking for the juice, and I found something pretty special offshore that I was able to run when it was calm at the beginning of the qualifying round, and run up a ton of weight and kind of use it to continue to supplement my bank fish by knowing I for sure had X amount of weight to sit on that day that I didn't have to generate on the bank. You know, I had X amount of weight that I was going to be able to go out and collect fishing offshore. And it was a really unique approach. But the thing is, when you're trying to take that unique off the wall approach in a tournament, your main focal points, especially on a place like the Harris Chain, is going to be like lake conditions. Meaning, if I'm trying to find something off the wall and I'm looking for something specific, not meaning I'm just going, I hope a school of 400 5-pounders lands in my lap. When you're actively looking for something unique, whatever that deal is that you're looking for, you need to go find the best conditions possible for that. Meaning you're going to have the population that lives a certain lifestyle. You know, on the Harris Chain, being separated lake to lake to lake makes it where, you know, each lake is its own little ecosystem. Each lake functions a little bit different. And so I knew to look for that offshore deal, I was going to have a group of fish that were a little bit earlier along. You know, they aren't as far along as some of the fish in the shallower, more stained lakes because that water temp's a little bit lower. They're not quite as far in that progression. I knew I had to find somewhere that didn't have a ton of offshore vegetation, because if there is that offshore vegetation, they're going to use it. And I wasn't interested in that bite, because offshore vegetation, although it can be good, rarely on a fishery like a Harris Chain is it fast, because the Harris Chain doesn't have a huge population. And if you disperse that across a ton of offshore vegetation, the ability for you to consistently put a bait in front of bass in a fast manner is going to be significantly depleted. So in terms of frequency, I was focusing on making the playing field as manageable as possible. How do I navigate it quickly and cover a lot of water fast with my eyes without having to make a cast? Because when I have scope for that 2.5 hours, That's what it's all about, is being as efficient as possible, covering as much water without casting as possible, just by using my eyeballs and assessing the situation. So I knew I probably needed an absence of vegetation, fish that were a little bit earlier along, and ideally a little bit more positive water clarity. And that drove me to the lake I ended up fishing in that event. And when I went there, I didn't have, I mean, I committed to it. Like, I knew that if that bite existed, it was going to be in that lake alone. And I went there and committed 2 days of practice to trying to find it. And not necessarily just offshore, but like the stuff, the main basin, outside Kissimmee grass / offshore stuff was what I wanted to commit to, because I knew if I could find it, I'd have it to myself, because a bunch of people weren't going to push that bite. And I would potentially be able to rack up a ton of weight in 2.5 hours and buy myself time in the tournament to practice. So that was the approach that I took. And, really with chain of lake situations or big playing fields, when you only have 2 days of practice, one of the biggest hints that I have is, like, assess before you get there what situation you're going to try to attack and approach, or what lake you're going to go to. If it's chain lakes like the Harris chain, pick a lake, pick one and commit. Or if you're on just a massive fishery, pick a zone of that massive fishery and commit your entire practice to learning about it, because it's a snowball effect. The first day you might only learn 8% of what there is to learn about it, but that's an 8% increase from 0, which is what you knew about it going into it. So let's say you take that 8%. Let's say you knew 1%, just for the sake of the math here. Let's say you knew 1% of what there was to know about the fishery, just from map study, from research, from weather, and had 1% of an understanding of what you were going to go do. After 1 day, let's say you go from 1% to 8%. That's a 7% increase, but that's multiplying what you understood by 8 times. You understand essentially 8 times what you understood in your research process. Meaning, if I had researched for 8 times as much time, maybe I would have reached that amount of understanding. But if you multiply that by another day of understanding, taking those units of information that you've collected and those things that you're like, okay, I understand that this is going on for sure. I may not understand a lot, but I know this is part of what's going on. And take that and plug that into different situations as you go along. Now you multiply that by 8 times, and you understand, instead of going from 1 day understanding 8%, maybe by the next day you understand 64% of what's going on. You multiply it by another 8 times, because you went out there and you took that day and compounded it by putting another day on top of that understanding. And you took that, what you already knew about it, and plugged it into a bunch of situations. Let's say you're like, okay, they are for sure pre-spawn. Now what do I do about that? I understand they're pre-spawn, but are they pre-spawn? What does the water clarity allow them to do? What vegetation is there? Is there vegetation that allows them to get shallow, or is there more offshore deep vegetation? Is that present? And so when you start plugging their pre-spawn, that thought process, into everything you do, okay, they're pre-spawn, maybe they're doing this. They're not doing this, so either maybe they're more pre-spawn than I thought, or a little bit later than I thought. Maybe they're right, on the breaking point. And taking that frame of thought and using it to kind of view everything you do as the lens by which you view it through, made it really easy once I spent 1 day in there to go, okay, they are primarily not up spawning. The primary population is not just up in a foot of water on bed yet. So I'm going to commit my time to understanding where they're at. And at that point, once I understood, okay, they haven't spawned yet, I understood the fact that they're probably just outside of those places. The full moon was a few days away. The weather was starting to turn that direction. And I knew they would start conglomerating around those spawning bays, those shallow flat zones. In Florida, it's all about those shallow flat zones that are 2 to 1.5 to 3 foot forever, with lots of isolated targets. And so if I found a zone that looked like that, a zone that I knew they would come up and spawn in, I knew the fish that were pre-spawn, that were offshore, were going to be just right outside those areas. And that's what happened. And by going out and spending a day to understand, okay, they are definitely not spawning yet. Even though I may have done the wrong thing for a full day of practice, I've confirmed what they are not doing. And in this time of year, it's really easy. If you draw that hard line and say, okay, most of them haven't spawned yet, then I'm just working on pre-spawn logic at that point, which means that it's just about figuring out what zones of the lake that they are set up right outside of, and what pieces of cover within those zones they're using to set up. And it becomes pretty easy from there. So with big playing fields, short practice periods, one big thing you got to do is commit. Understand all you can understand about the zone you're in, That way you can kind of, I mean, there's going to be a population present if you're in a big zone of water or in an individual lake. There is a population that lives there, and if you commit to figuring it out, you're probably going to be better off than just picking a little bit here and there and sightseeing rather than actually practicing.
Totally, definitely.
So I want to ask. I think as far as like reading the bass fishing textbook, if it exists, the logic of spawning area. I hear it all the time watching live. Is like, oh, I'm outside a spawning pocket. I'm in. They're going to move in from this area. They're in transition zones. You mentioned that earlier, and you talk about trying to find something special where you can, where you can intersect those bass, and that's how you win tournaments. Is you find that. But I think reading it is one thing. But actually doing it and finding it is another. Like, how do you actually do it? Like, is it, hey, I go to look at a map first and then just put the trolling motor down and scope? Are you idling these areas? Like, what does it look like to actually find something? And what does it take for you to realize, oh, this is something special or different?
So when we're talking about the pre-spawn, especially on fisheries with big fish or big populations, places that we're going to consider patternable. When we're talking about that, we're talking about places that probably, like, for example, Texas and Florida are the two common examples that people think about this time of year, the TVA, whatever it may be. When you talk about staging areas, you're talking about zones that they live in before they spawn, but they're using between areas that they spend the winter at and where they spawn. And so realistically, like, it's just logistics, man. They got fins. They have to swim. They don't teleport. They got to move by swimming. So I'm going to take the time to figure out, okay, this is the zone of the lake. In history, historical tournament data, things like that can help you determine this. But looking at your contours, understanding this is where the majority of the population lives. So I'm going to pick a block. I'm going to say this block is where a big whopping population lives historically. Regardless of time of year, there is a population that lives in this zone, whether it's 5, 7, 10 miles long, whatever it may be, zone. And then I'm going to find within that zone, I'm going to find the areas I'm like, okay, when it's the wintertime, this is where they live. This 100%, whether it be a steep break, whether it be a basin that you would assume would have bait in it, or whether it's a place where they get on brush on flats, whatever it may be, isolate what makes them do certain things during the winter on that fishery and find those areas on your map and look at it and go, okay, this is definitely where they winter. But then get on your map's helpful because you're going to see the contours, you're going to see how flat it is. And, the flatter, really for good spawning habitat, you've got to have flat bottom where you can accommodate a big population in one area. And you have to have targets for them to spawn on, because bass will spawn on nothing, but they primarily prefer to spawn on something. They want to spawn on a brick, a bush, a clump of grass. They want a reference, a dock post. They want a frame of reference to move around. And so what I'm going to do from there is I'm going to go, okay, this is where they winter. What is the most adjacent place to this that I can look at on Google Earth and on my mapping and understand, okay, I have the contours that are flat enough to hold a big population, and I have ample cover for that population to use. If I can get on Google Earth and find that, hey, or with my eyeballs when I'm on the fishery and look up there and go, well, they may not be growing yet, but there's a ton of pad stems in this zone here, or there's a bunch of bushes. They may not even be in the water. They may be 2 feet above the water. I did this at Rayburn last year in the Invitational. I had to have bushes in a creek to catch them, even though it was a February tournament. I was catching them in 8 to 12 feet of water. The bushes weren't even touching the water. But if there weren't a ton of bushes and willow trees in the back, there wasn't a population out front, because that's the direction they're going. That's where they're going to spawn, and having all of that ample cover in that right zone of water is what is going to draw a big population to it during the spawn. I mean, the fish generally are going to use the same zones to spawn every year. The majority population uses the same areas. And so you're just trying to cut them off at that point. And realistically, that's just part of like zoning it and figuring out, are they closer to winter or are they closer to the spawn? As they get closer to the spawn, you're more talking about flat stuff. You're more talking about cover that's a little bit deeper, maybe a little bit more stained water zones. Places where the water starts getting warmer faster. If you're closer to winter, you might be talking more main lake stuff. The first point outside of a bay, the first couple piles outside of a bay, whatever vegetation that's deep that's present in that fishery that's around those spawning zones, but well away from it. It might even be a mile and a half away from where they're going to spawn. But if those contours lead them in that direction, you're going to look for the most ample main lake stuff that is between their path, between where they winter and where they're going to go spawn. And it's just about cutting them off. That's all it is. And these fish this movement doesn't happen overnight. It's a transition. They'll start piling into areas. You'll notice a couple, and then you'll notice a bunch, and then you'll notice it's back to a few again, and then none over a couple week span with any stage of this process, because that population starts trickling in and it starts trickling out. And it follows a transition. It's not all of the fish at one time. Okay, there's 100 fish that live in a 500-yard zone a mile off the bank. Now all 500 of them up and move, and then all 500 up and move. It's 20 here, 70 here, 15 here, 10 here, 40 here, where it's just little trickle transition of a big population that continues to move in and replenish an area.
So, but I guess my question would be like, practically, so all of that makes sense, but it's all a guess until you drop the trolling motor in the water, right? How far along, closer to winter, closer to the spawn, you might have a really good guess, but practically, how do you, when you say for the Harris chain, how did you actually determine, oh, these fish are not there yet? Is it just casting, or is it? And for you, I know that obviously scope plays a big part, and that's probably different than what we've done, at least done in the past, and certainly different from what other anglers do. So talk about how you actually realize where in that, along that spectrum of winter to spawn, how do you actually determine that, and then go from there to actually break down a lake?
Yep. So in Florida, you have a big spawn period. I mean, it goes from December all the way to April. You've got fish spawning all through that time period. So it's different. But really, one of the biggest indicators of what I was looking for is if you pull up and you drop scope and you notice you're not seeing very many fish on those hard pieces of cover off the bank, whether it be a dock pole, whether it be a little piece of brush, a little hard spot on the bottom, clean spot on the bottom, whatever it may be. And you're not noticing fish on that hard stuff. That's going to be an indication that you don't have a post-spawn population. If you get up shallow and you're not seeing any fry garters, you're not seeing empty beds, you're not seeing a ton of bass on beds, because there's a lot of tilapia beds there. It's a bit of a concern trying to figure out what's a tilapia bed and what's a bass bed. You just got to kind of read it by where it's set up. How deep is it? Is it a very circular bed, or is it a little bit irregular? But all those factors, I essentially started just trying to piece it together by going, okay, I'm going to get a little bit off the bank. I'm going to get on that kind of mid-shallow off the bank stuff, because that's generally what gets good first post-spawn, that mid-shallow off the bank stuff. 4 to 7 foot of water, any piece of hard cover, any piece of very isolated target is going to have, and generally it won't just be one fish like it is a lot of times in the pre-spawn. It'll be small groups. That wasn't present. Went up shallow, looked for some fry garters. Those weren't present. Never saw a ball of fry the entire time. So okay, they're not post-spawn. All those, defining factors that make post-spawn, one that's very classic in Florida is the edge of pads. Getting right on the edge of lily pads is a big thing during the post-spawn. Whether that be throwing a frog, throwing a reel in a swim bait, whatever it may be, that can be a big deal in the post-spawn. That bite was not present. So I kind of had those indications. Okay, it's not post-spawn. The arrows being that full moon wasn't occurring until our off day, and that it had been cold prior to when we got there, and it was just starting to warm up as we got there, was all the arrows are pointing to they haven't spawned yet, but a lot of them probably will during the tournament. So I was already under that impression, but I realized they weren't post-spawn. I started pulling up shallow and trolling around, at Mach speed, just flying around, looking to see if I could see any on bed or spook some. That's one of my favorite ways when you can see. The water clarity is pretty good there. You had probably 2 foot of visibility, which is more than normal. And so I flew around on the trolling motor just seeing if I could spook some, just seeing if I could go see them and see if there's a big population up very shallow. Because if they're shallower than 2 foot in water that's clean enough that you can see them with your eyes in Florida, they're there for one reason only. They're not going to be living that shallow when you can look down and physically see them for any reason other than coming up to spawn. And I trolled around and just never spooked them. I saw 2 bedfish the entire practice. And I was like, it's not happening yet. And it's probably not happened in a big way yet because I didn't notice a lot of empty bass beds. There were some tilapia beds, but most of those were inhabited by tilapia, big, ginormous, freaking 8-pound, pale-looking tilapia. Yeah, they're huge. And so I noticed that, and I was like, yeah, everything points to they are not spawning yet. And although our weather pointed to the fact that it was probably going to happen, realistically, I knew being that there were pretty much no post-spawn fish. There were no signs of a ton of fish having spawned. The majority population had not spawned yet. And so I started looking ahead of it. And that led me to 2 zones that I ended up fishing in that were, both 7 to 10 feet right outside of a major spawning area that had massive populations of pretty much just white, fat fish. I mean, like this time of year, that's a great indication of what you're looking for is when you catch one that's really pale compared to what you're seeing up in some of the shallower water and up around some of the bank cover. If you're seeing ones that are noticeably more pale, noticeably less coloration, and that look physically healthy, you're talking, that is a screaming indication that that population's been wintering. It's not made any transition toward getting up on the bank. And as soon as I saw that start happening, I knew that like majority population that week in the lake that I was in was not going to have spawned yet. And most of it wasn't going to spawn even while we were there, although some of it did and was part of my plan later on in the tournament.
Totally.
So, but then how did you catch that first very white pre-spawn fish? Like,
so practically speaking, cast to catch. I pulled up in an area outside of a spawning zone that I presumed would probably have some fish that were pre-spawn. Started looking around, a lot of trash fish, lot to look at. But when you get outside some of those zones, really you're looking at like, where is the most convenient little depression leading into it? Is there a little bit of a crease in the contour? And anywhere there was a little crease in the contour, you were more likely to see 1 or 2 sitting in that zone, whether it be a couple feet above the bottom or a few feet above the bottom. They would set up in that last little, deep area leading up in the closest little deep spot leading up to those spawning areas. And that was kind of my deal. And I picked up a worm initially, started pitching at them, and like noticed they would show some interest. A couple of them would bite it. It wasn't super good. But then I picked up that jerk bait, and like if you threw that jerk bait in front of one, you would swear he's never seen bait. So anyways, started throwing that jerk bait out there, and they acted like they'd absolutely never seen it in their entire lives. It was incredible. You'd snap it a couple times, and it was like they just come to life in a way that they never did when you threw a worm in front of them. And it was super fun. You caught almost everything you saw. And like, that was my indication of like, okay, I'm catching almost everything I see. These fish are really healthy. Like, this is a deal that's probably going to carry me through this tournament. And it really did. But when you're looking for that deal, practically speaking, you're probably talking about a few approaches. That jerkbait's killer. A worm profile of some sort. If you're on more Highlandish reservoirs, your minnow is going to be a player. Swim baits are going to be a player. But realistically, the A-rig is going to be a player as well. You're in a couple bait categories. You're not, in that warm water, shallow water period of time where you've got a lot of different options that you can play with. You're in a couple zones. You are in something to draw them to the bottom, something that purely suspends and allows them to catch up with it, and some sort of shad imitator. And as long as you're in those 3 categories, you're probably going to have a high chance of success, and you're going to be able to keep it simple enough that you can find them fast because you're not having to try a million different techniques. One of them will be right.
Totally. Awesome. So Drew, kind of diving into your MLF tournament and the BBT tour, knowing you can only scope in one period, how do you approach that? Let's say you find these 2 awesome zones like you're kind of talking about, white belly bass, and they're, fat, beautiful, they're awesome. And like, how do you choose what period to scope in for that tournament?
So realistically speaking, you're trying to decide whether a tournament's going to be a primarily community whole pressure oriented tournament like Conroe was, where it was like, get it while it's hot, make sure you get to it before everyone destroys it. Or is it a tournament where you feel like your stuff might be a little bit less pressured and that you have it to yourself and you can play, what is the best opportunity to catch them? Am I waiting for current? Am I waiting for a certain tide? Am I waiting for the sun to get out? Am I trying to fish it when it's at the least wind possible, which was the situation at the Harris Chain last week? And whatever situation, whatever variable you isolate as being like your most important variable to catching them, you play that time of day right. And if it doesn't necessarily matter, in the situations where you feel like you can catch them at any time of day kind of equally well, the move is going to be, okay, if I can catch them equally well at any time of day when I'm using scope, what is the best time of day to not use it? What is the best period of the day to go fish the bank? Because in the summertime, I feel like there's a good possibility you're going to catch them better off the bank with it in the midday and afternoon, and your best opportunity to catch them on the bank is going to be the first thing in the morning. And that's going to be your best opportunity to go catch cheap weight quick. And so, realistically, if the first thing you're going to assess is there fishing pressure? Second is going to be conditions. And third is going to be if none of those factors play, if there's no fishing pressure and the conditions allow you to do whatever, whenever, then you default to what is the best time of day to not use it and maximize my fishing ability without it. And that's kind of going to be my 3-step process. I think it's going to be pretty foolproof in terms of like that being the natural transition you go through. And just understanding how to play that's going to be really important, because when you only have 2.5 hours, you got to be dialed and you got to land on them immediately and make it worth all it is. Because the Harris chain, it took me the first day, took me 45 minutes to get dialed, but I had the right conditions. So once I got dialed, I caught them. Second day, poor conditions, horrible conditions for it. It took me a while to get dialed, and even still didn't get a ton of bites. I moderately outpaced everyone that wasn't using it by maybe 20%. Last day, conditions were awful. It took me a while to get dialed. And once I got dialed, I barely kept pace / a little bit outpaced. I think that day I may have 15 or 20%, about the same as the day before, outpaced the field in that period of time. Which means you got to kind of do some hardcore math going into the tournament. Is like, what do I think I can catch without it? What do I think I can catch with it? And which is going to be more valuable to me? Am I able to have a very good shallow deal going on that is foolproof enough that I feel like, okay, I can for sure catch 30 or 40 pounds in a day up shallow? Or is it a situation where you go, that shallow bite's not the way I need it to be? I'm going to need to do a lot of my heavy lifting in that 2.5 hours so I can spend offshore, or that 2.5 hours that I can see even if I'm fishing up shallow. But you're really going to have to be honest with yourself going to the tournament of like what you're truly capable of on the fish that you're on. And do you need to go make a gamble during your scope period to use that 2.5 hours to prepare yourself for when you don't have it, rather than using that 2.5 hours to go cream them offshore? And there's going to be some certain situations where using that intel for 2.5 hours, that 2.5 hours is going to make your next 2.5 hours, 3 times more valuable, because you took that opportunity to use it to go look around and see what's going on and stay in touch with them, rather than trying to just force it and catch some fish at the same rate as you would have without it, just a different population. And you're going to have to be honest with yourself before the tournament starts of what you think you're truly capable of.
Totally. So would you kind of say with this one period of forward-facing sonar, has it kind of changed up your practice at all? Or are you still attacking it very similarly? Like, what is your kind of future with this one period? And I kind of want you to dive into your future, with one period of forward-facing sonar for the BPT tour, then we can maybe even dive in the invitationals where you can use forward-facing sonar.
Yep. So the big thing, I think, and this is kind of some juice in my opinion of the format, which is the Bass Pro Tour format. You guys have watched it to know. I've watched it to know. The deal has always been, because of Score Tracker and because of the zeroing of the weights twice throughout the tournament, the one-word answer to why you win or lose tournaments is practice. Do you get to practice in the tournament? Because the rich get richer in our format. If you're on enough to catch enough weight to put yourself ahead where you can go find more, you just get more ahead. And how do you find a way to jump out of the gate burning hot? And I'm going to be honest, man, the best way to do that's always going to be on some juicy little sneak hole that you can go find, that you can go take scope and exploit and go catch absolutely everything you can catch at the most mock pace you can catch it. And my approach the last 2 tournaments has been this way, and it's probably going to continue to be this way in most tournaments, is the 2 days of practice, I'm going to use them exclusively to find what I'm going to do the third of the day that I do have scope. Because if I spend 2 days intentionally chasing that offshore deal, I will find something special. And if I find something special, I will go clobber them hard enough at the beginning of the tournament that I'll buy myself that 10 hours of, those 4 periods that I have in the qualifying round, 10 hours to go practice the bank. And so by the end of those 2 days, I will have probably had a period and a half using scope that I really tried to crush them, maybe half a period of scope to go look a little bit, at an hour, hour 15. And I'll ideally have 10 hours that I can spend on the bank to dial in a way to supplement what I've got going on offshore, because if it's special enough to do that, I'm still going to have some left over during the knockout round. How do I go and find a way to supplement that with that 10 hours in the qualifying round that I can go practice on the bank? And being able to catch yourself enough weight that you can trust yourself to kind of him all around and cherry pick some stuff as you go through the qualifying round to pad your weight to make sure you make it, but enough freedom that you can go do some silly stuff is always been the defining factor in winning and losing tournaments on the Bass Pro Tour, and it's going to continue to be even when you can't use scope. Buying yourself practice time in the tournament is the name of the game with the Bass Pro Tour.
Well, what about pre-practicing? So, I mean, we've had some in that. Well, what I mean by that is, I'm going to dive into it a little bit. Is we've had conversations off the record, and I think you've even said on the record that you have utilized forward-facing sonar in its ability to give you information about bass behavior more than anybody else. And what that translates to is, I think you've even said it on record, like you used to make every single cast, you watch your bait every cast. You're never not looking at it. And so now you're forced to not look at it. Or like, are you like, what are you doing? Like, are you like practicing turning it off? Like, hey, I'm just gonna go fishing today and turn it off. Like when you're not at a tournament, like what does that even look like? Or are you just like, nope, I'm gonna crush them for 2.5 hours and then I'm just gonna wing it?
When I'm not at a tournament or when I'm at a tournament, if I have the ability to see what's going on that moment in time, at any time, I will always choose to see. Because that ability to see and that experience that I just intook information. If I throw my chatterbait up by a dock and I wind it, and I've got my eyes closed and I wind it to the boat, and my chatterbait pops out of the water and there's not a fish attached, what did I just learn? That on that specific cast, potentially, maybe the chatterbait casted in the way I casted it, wound in the way I wound it. Something about it may or may not have been right. Maybe there was a fish, maybe there wasn't. I don't really know. I can't control the experiment because I don't have the details. If I'm watching on scope and I fire that chatterbait up there and I wind it by the dock and nothing comes out, I go, it's not the chatterbait's fault, it's the dock's fault. I can blame it on the dock. And then if I wind that chatterbait by that dock and he follows it out and he comes up on my chatterbait and I snatch it and he spooks and swims off, I go, okay, that wasn't the dock's fault. That wasn't necessarily the chatterbait's fault. That was my fault. I did something with the action that made the fish go, I'm over it. If I fire that chatterbait up there, I wind it past that dock and that fish follows it all the way to the boat and doesn't commit, I go, okay, that's not the dock's fault. I didn't do anything different, so that's not my fault. That's the chatterbait's fault. And I can pin down whose fault it is because it's always one of three things' fault. It's either where you threw it, what you threw, or you. It's always one of those things.
No. It's sometimes it's the fish's fault. Okay, it has to be. My logic is if I'm if I drag a bait through a piece of cover and I get snagged, and that's the fish's fault. He should have bit it before I got snagged. Not fighting? That's his fault. It's not on
dude. I like to blame it on him sometimes, but like realistically, in a tournament sense, if we ever start blaming it on the fish, we're choosing to lose because somebody's gonna play the right cards. But dude, so often I'm like, it is your fault, fish. I hate you. I hope you swim just over the dam and you're just out of this fishery forever. You're just expelled from getting to live here. Like there's some times where I'm like, you know what? I hope your genetics don't get proliferated through the next generation of bass in this fishery. But that being said, chances are it was my fault. Chances are it was the wearer's fault for him not even being there, or chances are it's the what's fault for what I chose to throw at him. And understanding those things by watching an interaction is really important because those interactions play out whether or not you're looking at it. Those interactions are happening. When you're watching it, it gives you the ability to make an adjustment or try to surmise some reason as to why what happened. But those interactions are happening even when you can't see them. And what you've learned by watching those interactions absolutely applies when you can't see it. I noticed when we were at Conroe that a lot of times my bait was just moving too fast for him in that grass. When I watched him on scope in practice, I watched it and I was like, it is just outpacing the fish. So I have a couple options, which is throw something totally different that I can get in the grass and not get hung up and be able to fish effectively. But what if they're not feeding down? And they weren't. And so I couldn't catch them on that. So I had to fish something up that did not, fish so fast that I had to pull it away from them, which meant I had to find a way to fish something up that wasn't a topwater because it was so cold, but I had to fish something above them that I was able to fish slow enough that they could close that distance. And so it led to me doing some sneaky modifications that we may save for a later date to the trap I was throwing. But I was throwing that trap and made those modifications, and it allowed me to fish that bait even when I was blind and couldn't see what was going on. I knew when I had a follower, they needed to have the ability to close that distance. And once I made those modifications, I went from catching 1 or 2 a period to catching 1 or 2 every 30 minutes. You know, I could rack up 7, 8 bites in scoreable bites in a period. And generally a couple of them were going to be pretty big ones. And it took me a while to diagnose that. I had to do a lot of practice in the tournament to figure out exactly where and what I needed to do. But once I did that, that logic that I had found in practice, or that thought process, played out in the tournament by me making a good adjustment, listening to what I had seen occur, and taking that as truth regardless of whether I could see that interaction happening or not. I knew that's the situation. And so I played into it, even though I couldn't see at the time.
Awesome. So whenever, let's say, you're shaking your minnow, you're throwing your Nico Rama, and like the fish just will not bite, and you're like, I made a perfect cast, I've done everything right here, why is this fish not biting? What do you do to make him bite? Like, let's say tournament day comes around, what are you going to do to make that bass bite? Or what changes do you make? I know you kind of touch on it without forward-face sonar, but what do you do? You're looking at forward-face sonar and they still won't bite. What are you doing to change it?
So in that situation, you're going to kind of try and assess what his issue is. Like, what's that bass's problem? Is the problem that he doesn't want something that's slow? Is the problem that he doesn't want to feed down? Is the problem that he doesn't want to feed up? Is the problem that he doesn't want to cover distance? Is the problem that he's been fished for too many times? I'm going to use my resources, whether that be a few different baits, whether that be my understanding of the area I'm fishing, watching what's going on around me. I'm going to take all those context cues and try to build a hypothesis as to why what happened and start playing into it. If it's fishing pressure, I'm going to give that bass some distance. I'm going to potentially fish my bait in a contrary manner to how I would assume. I'm playing chess, not checkers. I'm going to try and anticipate what other people would do in that situation and do something different. And I'm going to set up my boat a little bit different than I anticipate people would set it up, in terms of where I'm casting at them from, how I'm presenting a bait to them. And I'm gonna go try and be contrary. Like, if I assume fishing pressure is the problem, if I assume the problem is he doesn't want to cover distance, I'm going to try and do something that really is going to get him to engage with that bait very tightly in that little zone that he wants to move, because he doesn't want to leave wherever he's living. I want to either do something big and aggressive that's going to get his attention and get his curiosity piqued, or I'm going to throw a bait that's precise enough and slow enough that I can put it right on his dome. And I can make that fish engage with it whether he wants to or not. And then the other thing is, like, if it's, it's a rate of speed or a zone thing, I'm going to try a couple different baits. If it's I've diagnosed they won't eat something off the bottom, I'm going to throw away every bait in that category. I'm going to only pick up baits that they feed up on, and I'm going to pick up 2 or 3. I'm going to pick up one that's a straight retrieve, one that's an erratic retrieve with a little bit more aggression, and something that suspends potentially. If it's something on the bottom, I'm going to pick up something that is directly on the bottom if they're wanting to feed down. Something that's on the bottom, something big on the bottom, something big and kind of fast and responsive, like a heavy jig. And then I'll also pick up something that's close to the bottom, meaning there's really only one bait that comes to mind when I think about that, and that is the drop shot. It is not on the bottom. It's great for bass that want to feed toward the bottom, but occasionally you'll be in a situation where they want to feed down, but they don't want to eat something off the bottom. And drop shot's right for that sometimes. So it's just assess up, down. Does he want to stay in that zone, or will he fall over distance? And do I think these fish are pressured? And based on my assumption from there, is gonna be how I make those adjustments, especially in game. In game, it's all about adjustments. If you just sit there and plunk your bait at them over and over again, you watch 5-pounder after 5-pounder look at your bait and not eat it, you're doing something wrong. If you don't catch one, you did something wrong. Whether you threw the wrong what or whether you threw it in the wrong way. If you're throwing at a bass and he doesn't eat, you did something wrong. Make an adjustment. Listen to the bass. If a few of them don't eat, you're going to have to make an adjustment.
Totally.
Well, I was but more specifically, like the closing the distance one is one that I feel like anglers see. If you use forward facing at all, you'll have it happen more often than not, where fish follow and go, oh my gosh, he's right behind it, right behind it,
sniffing it,
or especially the slow followers, especially this time of year in the pre-spawn. So how, you talk about if he doesn't eat, you make the adjustment, but you also talk about bite percentages that you usually aren't at 100% with anything you do. So like, let's say one that's not closing the distance, that's falling slow. How do you make that assessment of, oh, do I need to just, say I'm throwing a 1/2 ounce bladed jig or a 1/2 ounce rattle trap. Hey, I need to go to a 1/4 ounce to slow it down so he catches up to it. Or do I need to, is the problem that I need to change baits? Or is it just, hey, that was just one that wasn't going to bite anyway? How do you make determine which of those is the factor that you need to change?
So when you're talking about that situation, just a given cast, you don't make those decisions based on a single cast. You make those decisions based on a set of casts to a set of fish, where you have an actual set of interactions that happened where you can go, okay, I definitely made a couple good approaches. I made a couple good casts that were at least a good distance from the boat. It wasn't just a half-hearted cast that was short distance that may or may not have been given time to develop. I made a few casts at a few fish at good distance, and it just didn't happen, especially if they're not closing that distance. When it's warmer and they're not closing the distance, my tendency is going to be, okay, I need to get a little bit bigger or a little bit more aggressive. If it is colder and they're not closing the distance, I'm going to tend to go, I need something that has drawing power, and doesn't necessarily mean bigger, but drawing power, something that is so curious that they have to check it out, or something that is slower / lighter, something that allows them to close that distance. Meaning an A-rig is by no means a small bait, but the baits themselves, the profiles themselves are small. The A-rig is the world's largest finesse technique. It's just a ball head swim bait, but 5 of them at the same time. And it is like, it's not a big bait. Big baits are the trick shed. Big baits are line throughs and things like that. Those are big baits. A-rig's not a big bait. A-rig has an immense amount of drawing power and allows you to reel it very slow because of the lift of the swim baits and the lift of the blade. So, depending on how I adjust that weight, I can make them close the distance by putting on bigger swim baits, lightening up the heads, putting on bigger blades, whatever I'm doing, splaying out the wires wider, like making an adjustment that allows them to potentially catch up to it. If that adjustment doesn't work, then chances are, if I can't get them to follow it the way I initially threw it, I slow it down, doesn't change anything. If the water's warmer, let's say I make it a little bit more aggressive, make bigger heads, bigger swim baits and bigger heads, or cramp it down, reel it faster, and none of that matters, I'm going to throw the bait out altogether. I'm going to start at a starting point where I assume is going to be kind of the all-around, it's capable of catching them in a variety of situations set up for whatever technique it is. And I'm going to fish it in kind of a, 70 overall kind of way. If you're talking about video games, I'm going 70 overall from the get-go with the way I rig anything. And then I'm going to get more tweaky as I go along, as I get told no. Because you're never, very, very rarely do you ever reach 100% bite ratio. But we're striving for it. We're trying to get that bite ratio as high as possible. So we're going to continue to make those adjustments and pay attention to those interactions and continue to generate positive interactions. Maybe it's not a bite, but it's, you notice instead of being a lazy follow, he was cartwheeling on it. Didn't bite it, but he was all over it. He did everything but bite it. And that's a positive interaction. That's a sign that we're moving in the right direction, even if we don't get a bite.
So is that all just time on the water primarily when it comes down to because again, in the A-rig scenario, you might slow it down and they get right on it. But if you throw out 100 bass, in my mind anyway, if you get them enough that look at it, one of them's going to bite it.
Mm-hmm.
But is it just time on the water that tells you, hey, I had 5 look at it, now's the time to change versus, because again, you're never going to hit 100%. But obviously 1%, that's a bite percentage, but that's not what you're looking for. So is it just time on the water of knowing, just kind of gut when, oh yeah, these are when I need to just change baits altogether, or this is about the best that we get.
In this situation, time on the water is a convenient answer, and I think it's the right one. Specifically, I'm going to say time on that water, not just the water, that water. If you go to where I'm at this week, at the Semi-Chain Lakes, and you're catching 25% of what you see, you're not doing a good enough job. You need to be catching more. You need to be catching 50, 75, 100%, close to 90% of what you see. If you're on Hartwell and you're catching 10% of every bass you see, you're about to have the most incredible day of bass fishing you've ever had on Lake Hartwell, because I promise you, you're going to see 1,200 of them, and you're going to catch 120. 10% bite ratio might be horrible somewhere else, but it's all relative to how many bass you're going to see in that day, and how good can we make it? Not can we get it to 100%. How good can we make it? Because all I'm trying to do is make it where, out of my interactions with bass, I'm going to take my situation, I'm going to try and set myself up for success with my equipment, with my line size, with my hooks, for execution purposes, with my boat positioning, make sure I don't blow out fish before I ever get to fish for them. I'm going to do all those things right. And on top of that, I'm going to try and get my bite percentage to as good as it can possibly get, where I can stack every odd in my favor, where I don't have to generate as many opportunities as someone else to catch the same amount of weight or more. I'm trying to make it where basically this is the epitome of like, prepare for the worst, hope for the best. You hope they're all going to be dumb. You hope you're going to see every bass lake. You hope you're going to see more than everyone else. You hope you're going to see bigger ones than everybody else. But the fact of the matter is, rarely is that ever going to be the case. Fish like your next interaction is going to be the last one you have with a bass all day long. And then do it with every single opportunity you get all day. Meaning, make sure your boat positioning is perfect. Make sure your equipment's perfect. Make sure your bait is dialed to a T. Is it the right weight? Is it the right profile? Is it the right action or cadence that you're fishing in? Make sure you've experimented with that as much as possible to where you can dial it not just 8% bite ratio, but to 10% or even 12%. That 8%, 12% might only be a 4% jump, but that is essentially 50% more bites than you're going to get at that 8% bite ratio, because you went from 8 to 12. You increased by 4%, which was half of that 8%. It might not seem like a big difference, but it's going to be a 50% difference in your actual total catch. It's going to make a big difference. And dialing those things to the nth degree is the way to give yourself the freedom to suck and not suck. That's my goal every day. Give myself the freedom to not suck even when I suck.
I just love how analytical you are with everything you do. You know what I mean? Like with fish you're casting in Sonar, why is each fish in each stage? Just a kind of an overall question I've always had, and I kind of want your opinion on this. When you're thinking about pressured fish and pinging from Sonar, pinging from forward-facing Sonar, do you think that's really affecting them? Do you think it's going to affect them in, the next 5 to 10 years? Do you think in 5 years, 10 years comes down the road, we're going to be shining our, Sonar around and see one suspended 20 foot down, Chinese going to swim the opposite way? Do you think that's going to be the case, or kind of what are your thoughts on that?
I think that effect is a good bit overhyped. Bass, sound doesn't work that way. I mean, yes, you can kind of direct it, but sound is going to disperse at an incredible rate through the water. It's going to be hearable to those bass within a good radius of your boat, whether you're pointing it directly at them or not. They're going to be able to hear it, which means that to truly train them to move or shift away, every time you swipe that beam across them, you'd have to throw your bait dead on them. Because, yes, there will be a difference in the intensity of the sound, but ultimately they're going to hear that sound around. It's going to change. You're going to pan around. You're going to unknowingly go past them, and then eventually you go back and realize they were there. And, there's just too much inconsistency in that situation. It's like the Pavlov dog thing. If you don't ring the bell every time you feed the dog, if you don't feed the dog every time you ring the bell, you're creating a very confusing situation. It's a bass is an educatable creature. It's not an inherently smart creature. Anyone that's ever fished a farm pond knows that. A bass is inherently dumb. He is very educatable. He's going to remember those interactions, but they're inherently dumb. So just it takes a lot of interactions to teach them not to do something. And as far as sound goes, that's not an interaction like setting the hook on one on something he just ate is. That's him hearing a sound or hearing a stimulus, but it's not always associated with him getting jacked in the face. Not always is he going to get thrown in front of when he hears that. Not always is he going to bite when he hears that. Not always is he going to get hooked when he hears that. And the other thing is, I've noticed there are fish that notice when your frequency is more intense, when you're looking towards their direction, but it's not bass. Catfish notice. Catfish, I'm going to be honest, we hate on them. I don't like catching them in tournaments. They annoy the heck out of me. But dang it, catfish are more in tune with their environment than bass are. For sure. Catfish will notice when you're, and I think it has to do with their little face tentacles, their whiskers.
I was going to say, they better notice more than environment.
if they're going to look that goofy, they better have a use, and they definitely do, because catfish are very much more in tune with what's going on. They're way spookier than bass. They're a lot more likely to turn their nose up at your bait and realize it's fake and spook. Bass don't spook that often when they see your bait. It happens occasionally, but it takes a lot of pressuring or something very, very odd for them to do it. Catfish, if they don't bite, they spook because they notice there's something wrong about it and they don't want any part of it, and they're gone. Or you point your transducer at them and you notice them. They're flat and they just start dipping down and they start going to the bottom. And catfish, I got to give catfish, the Medal of Honor when it comes to recognizing your transducer. They are the most in tune fish in fresh water when it comes to knowing you're looking at them. But bass, however, generally not as in tune. It takes a lot of training. It would take the right fishery with the right anglers consistently on it. It would take a hyper suspended fishery for that to ever occur. And the other thing is your sound doesn't end where your screen ends. Your sound keeps going. And so it's not necessarily about what you can see. It's about how far your sound actually goes. And you're emitting that frequency far beyond what you're actually seeing on your screen. That sound doesn't end at that black edge that is the edge of your Garmin unit. That sound goes on past that. And it's really hard to be consistent enough with point sound dome on every single fish ever. They're going to hear it a lot even when they're not getting fished for. So I think it's something that's very much overhyped. Boat pressure matters. I don't think sound pressure matters a lot.
Awesome. Well, Jack, did you have anything else?
I mean, I feel like we've covered quite a gamut.
Yeah, I'd say
we've covered a journey of bass fishing and scoping and shallow and deep and transitions and how to make them catch up with your bait and changing baits and enough to make my head spin.
Yeah, I've definitely learned a lot this podcast. I think it's just awesome how analytical you are, Drew. And, thank you so much for hopping on with us.
No doubt, dude. It's been a really good time. I always enjoy it. And to date this podcast, I'm in practice at the Kissimmee chain right now. Awesome. We're getting ready for the first invitational of the year. And I think this one could turn out pretty well. That Nico Rama is getting bit at, we say 100% bite ratio is not possible. If I don't botch it with my boat positioning, I'm catching everything I look at. And I could potentially, there's a very good likelihood if I get the opportunity to fish day 1 and day 3 this week, I think there's a potential I could catch the biggest bag I've ever caught in a 5-fish tournament this week. So I'm pretty excited about it. Had over the last 2 weeks being in Florida, right around the spawn, I've had some pretty incredible bites on that Nico Rama. I caught an almost 8 Harris chain on it. Had one today that was in excess of 8 on it, and it's caught me a lot of big ones over the last 2 weeks and made me a lot of money. And I think this one, if it all goes right, that Nico Rama could be the ticket to making a whole lot of money down here at the Kissimmee chain. That's
awesome. We're wishing you a lot of luck in this tournament.
He doesn't need luck. He's got scope.
Yeah. I'll take as much day 2 luck as you guys can muster. Because that day we will be Nico Rama-ing, but I promise you it will be far less precise and far less efficient.
Totally. Awesome. Well, Jack and I'm starving, so you're to eat some food.
I think so. I think we'll let you go too and go catch some more.
Yeah, good luck this week.
I appreciate you guys.
Thanks. We'll see you.
See ya.
Oh, there we go. Oh my gosh, this is